And now what everybody's been waiting for, organic gardening for everyone. We're delighted to have John Root, naturalist and organic gardener, as our presenter. John will be providing practical advice and inspiration to us gardeners tonight. He has wonderful stories and information to share. There will be a Q&A after this talk, so you can go ahead into the Q&A section and write your question, and we will go through them and ask them offer. We will consolidate questions just to try and keep everything timely. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. John Root. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Matthew. I have a question. Can you see me or can you just see my slides?
I can see you.
Okay, I'd rather you not, because I don't want to be a distraction. I don't want to be a distraction to my slides. So
if you want to stop, you can stop your video. I don't know if I can stop your video if you'd like.
Yes. Thanks.
No problem. I'm going to stop mine and I'm going to mute it from here, but I'll be right here.
So welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join me today. When I do programs in person, I often ask for a show of hands. Do you think you have a green thumb? And some people will raise their hands. And then how many people don't think they have a green thumb? It's surprising how many people will raise their hand in response to that question. And really, when you think about it, how is it possible for someone not to have a green thumb? I mean, either you love doing it or you don't. And really, that's the bottom line, is enthusiasm. And if you have enthusiasm, you're guaranteed to have success, in my opinion. It's a combination of motivation, because we love to eat healthy food and nutritious and good tasting food. Some people do it to save money, but most of all, gardening is just one of those things that people enjoy doing. And if it's at all possible, they'll go out and do that and make that a priority. And there's so many ways to learn. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to have disappointments here and there, but you'll learn from them. Everyone has, they're just plants after all. You'll learn from your mistakes, but hopefully you'll learn a lot in this program so that you won't make some mistakes that you otherwise would have made. And if you've got sun, if you've got rain or a source of water when there's a drought, and if you've got seeds or plants that are healthy, you're bound to win. So organic gardening, what does it mean? Most people think of it in terms of what you don't do. In other words, you don't use synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, but I'd rather think in terms of what is it? And what it is cultivating an ecosystem that sustains and nourishes plants, soil microbes, and beneficial insects. So how about that? When you're gardening, you're cultivating an ecosystem. I'm going out to cultivate an ecosystem. You can tell someone in your house, and you're going out to your backyard and doing your gardening. Okay, what are the benefits of organic gardening? Healthier, more vigorous, disease and stress-resistant plants. That's a big bonus. Safer and more nutritious produce, something else that really motivates people to go organic. And then finally, saving money and labor or time. And if all these are true, why would anyone garden any other way than organically? So just to underline these points, this is what organic produce has more of. And there's some debate about this, but I believe that there's enough confirmation of this in the research that I can make these claims. More of those wonderful nutrients that our bodies need, and less of the water, nitrates, and toxic chemicals that we don't need, that non-organic produce often has. And if you hold some this stuff that you call soil or dirt from your garden, they actually mean different things, these two words. Dirt is inert, dirt is lifeless, but soil is alive. And often people are not aware of this, but a teaspoon of soil, billions of bacteria, and huge number of different kinds of bacteria in that teaspoon of soil. Actinomycetes, which no one's ever heard of, most people have never heard. And yet they're just as numerous as bacteria. They're kind of a cross between bacteria and fungi. And then the fungi themselves, these filaments called hyphae that are traveling through the soil, yards of them, yards and yards in a teaspoon of soil. Algae, interestingly, protozoa, which might be a surprise to you. You remember seeing protozoa swimming around in a drop of water? Well, they're also in your soil, and they'll swim around when there's just a film of moisture to swim in. And then nematodes also can swim around, these microscopic worms. They are the heroes of your soil. They are why your soil is alive. And they also are the base of the soil food web, which in turn feeds everything. So it all starts with organic matter, waste, residue, metabolites from plants, animals, and microbes. So anything that used to be organic or used to be part of something that was living is organic. And then the bacteria and the fungi go to work on it. And that's their food. And then bacteria and fungi in turn are food for the larger, the nematodes, and the nematodes in turn are food for other organisms, and on up the food chain we go. So again, the soil is alive, and we all benefit from that, and the plants included. And I want to talk especially about this wonderful symbiosis. And there will not be a quiz at the end, but isn't that a fascinating word, mycorrhizal, with 2 R's and an H? Myco means fungus, and rhizal means root. So it's fungus root. And on the left, this is a cross-section of root you're looking at. The blue is those hyphae or filaments I was talking about that are fungi. And notice how they're actually traveling through the root and in between the cells. And as if that's not impressive enough, on the right-hand side, we have what's called the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And the arbuscules are these branching filaments that are actually inside the cells of the root. What is going on here? It looks like an infection, but indeed it is a cooperation or symbiosis. And what's happening is those fungi, when they're penetrating the root, are delivering water and nutrients. Incredible, to the root. That's so important that the plant is willing to sacrifice and freely give at least 20 to 30% of their photosynthase, the sugar and everything else they make. Here you go, fungi. Thank you very much. And in exchange, we'll take that water and nutrients that we need so much of. Water absorption, protection from pathogens is another thing that these fungi do for their root partners. So in order to encourage mycorrhizal fungi, which of course you want to do, now you know how important they are. And by the way, every plant out there in nature, whether it's in your garden or growing in the wild, everything except members of the brassica family, the mustards, the broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, etc. They don't use mycorrhizal fungi, but every other plant out there has this partnership going on. So in order to encourage mycorrhizal fungi, guess what? Minimize the use of manure. Don't overdo manure. Also, don't use synthetic fertilizer. You can imagine that fungi don't take too kindly to synthetic fertilizer. Well, you'll learn more about it in a second, but and also minimize digging. If you're a fungus, you don't want someone to, all those filaments are there for a reason. They're spanning, they're traveling all through the soil, and that every time you dig, you're going to be disturbing those filaments, and especially rototilling, which we'll learn about. Now, Sarah Wright, what a hero she was. In 1994, she discovered something called glomalin, which is, think of it as the armor of fungi traveling through the soil, these tiny threads to make them stiff and to make so they can span the gaps, these microscopic gaps between particles of soil, because there's a lot of weathered rock, namely soil, sand and silt and clay. And so there are a lot of spaces, and the fungi need to span those gaps. Well, the glomalin then is that armor, and it's incredibly important. It clumps the soil particles, giving the soil tilth. It stores more carbon than humus. People used to think, before Sarah Wright discovered glomalin, they used to think that humus was the main repository of carbon in the soil. A highly stable form. It takes years and years and years for this stuff to break down. So carbon is being sequestered in the soil. Before I go on, I want to underline the fact that while we think about trees as being very important, which they certainly are in sequestering carbon, in this day and age, we've got to sequester carbon and halt global warming, and that's one of our tools. But glomalin in the soil is also sequestering carbon. Who would have thought? So what does rototilling do? And I hope I'm not alarming too many people here, but I mean, and I will say that it's always possible for soil to recover, but these are the reasons why it's discouraged, because it causes compaction due to settling. Isn't that interesting? Causes tiller pan, because those those tines are just going to go so deep and not any deeper. And the level where they're passing, they're glazing the soil surface, making it hard. That's what tiller pan is, making it hard for the roots to go past that tiller pan. It ruins the soil structure, destroys worm tunnels. It consumes soil nutrients by bringing them to the top, and their oxidation of those nutrients happen. It inverts the soil, displacing the bacteria, fungi, and earthworms. And finally, it exposes weed seeds, bringing them up to the surface and inviting them to grow, which you definitely don't want to do. So there they are, benefits of no-till gardening: less labor, soil microbes thrive, conservation of soil organic matter, conservation of moisture. Now you're going to wonder, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to start a garden? This is how you can start a garden. If you're starting a garden from grass, for example, and you want to, okay, I want to, or what if you have a patch of poison ivy? Or what if you have some weeds? Same approach. Smother it with something that's biodegradable, and cardboard is usually the material of choice. You can use newspaper too, but if you need 6 thicknesses of newspaper if you're going to use newspaper, and you do need to overlap considerably, whether it's newspaper or cardboard, to make sure that the vegetation below isn't going to come up. By the way, you can do this sheet mulching any month of the year, any month, even in the middle of winter if there's no snow on the ground. Go ahead and put down your barrier layer, which is the cardboard or newspaper. And then if you're starting a garden, it's great if you've got some compost as the next layer, as you can see in this bottom left corner. Then on top of that, you put down mulch. Now, you'll notice this product here, cardboard comes in a roll. It's not corrugated, but it does the trick. One of the brands is Ramboard, but you can get cheaper brands than that. And you just roll it. Painters use it to protect the floors when they're painting. So you can, if you have a large scale project and you don't have a lot of cardboard, think about just buying a roll and putting it down as your barrier layer. What does mulch do? It suppresses weeds, keeps the soil moist, keeps the soil cool, and enriches the soil, and makes it impossible for weeds to grow, either to come up or to move in. So here are some possibilities if you're doing a vegetable garden, and most vegetables are annuals. Grass clippings can be a mulch. Straw, but grass clippings can mat. That's not the best, in my opinion. Straw is a good one. Shredded leaves are excellent. And pine straw, pine needles, pine straw, it's the same thing. Now, you might have heard that pine needles make the soil acidic. It's not true. Recent research has shown that. So pine needles are just about my favorite mulch, really. Or leaves too, they're both great. If you're starting perennial beds, you can use shredded leaves or pine straw, but keep in mind that shredded leaves are going to decompose faster than some other materials like pine bark or wood chips or chip branch wood. Chip branch wood, incidentally, is what happens when you put branches in the chipper. And you get, it's great stuff because you have some, the bark and the twigs and the leaves have more nitrogen than just straight wood chips would. So let's talk about pine straw mulch. This is one of the reasons or some of the reasons I love it. Provides the perfect level of acidity, breaks down slowly, easy to handle, lightweight, economical, easy to apply, breathes well, doesn't compact, allows for water filtration, doesn't float and wash away, and looks great. End leaf mold, excellent stuff, just wonderful stuff. I will say, by the way, that if you have trees on your property, consider just leaving the leaves where they are for nature, because caterpillars are going to drop down from the leaves and they want to hide over the winter, and it's important for them to be able to do that. And so much other small wildlife, you could think of it, all those invertebrates that are happy in leaf litter, which in turn feeds the other animals. So consider leaving, if you possibly can, leave the leaves under the tree at least, out to the drip line. But you can often find huge quantities of leaves that your neighbors will put out on the curb. And almost always they'll say, sure, you can help yourself if you ask them. And then you've got this great mine of leaves that will make, you can just use it as it is, as mulch, or you can use it in making compost. So leaf mold improves soil structure. It increases water retention in soils by over 50%. It provides fantastic habitat for earthworms and other soil life. And also consider, it's not just farmers who use cover crops, it's also gardeners who can do, when you, at the end of the season, when you're done gardening and you're not harvesting anything else, why not put your bed to bed with cover crops? Because they suppress weeds, they build soil fertility and tilth, and they prevent leaching of nutrients. So rye is one example. You can have annual rye or more perennial rye that resumes growing in the spring. Field peas and oats is a great combination because the peas fix atmospheric nitrogen. They're nitrogen fixing, and they enrich the soil. And the oats make plenty of organic matter. Sorghum, incredibly, this stuff grows to as tall as 12 feet. It makes large amounts of organic matter, as you can imagine. You could plant that just 7 weeks before frost. Buckwheat is a great ground cover and very fast growing, quick canopy to shade weeds. And then clover, again, nitrogen fixing. Here is the problem with synthetic fertilizer, and it's awfully tempting, right? But if you're an organic gardener, you're not going to use it, and I'm about to tell you why. But first, just let's try to understand these numbers. 10, 10, 10, that's a lot of nitrogen with the first number, phosphorus, the second number, potassium, the third. And yes, potassium is the abbreviation for potassium is K for some reason. NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are the macronutrients, the nutrients, that the chemicals that plants most need to grow. So those numbers are very tempting because those are high numbers. That's a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. However, the nitrogen, there's too much of it in that bag, and not enough trace minerals, which makes the plants weak, watery, vulnerable to insect pests and diseases. The wrong kind of nitrogen works too fast and leaches into the water stream. Not good. The wrong kind of phosphorus ties up trace minerals. The wrong kind of potassium, bad for some plants, harsh on the soil. This stuff acidifies the soil. It kills the soil microbes, which you now know are your heroes and your partners because they are the soil's heroes, the plant's heroes. You don't know what's in that bag. It might contain sawdust, sand, dirt. I guess the manufacturers aren't obliged to tell you. It might even have toxic industrial waste, that filler. Bad for our health because the nitrates and nitrosamines contaminate our groundwater and also the plants themselves. If they have nitrates, you don't want to be eating nitrates in your food. And bad for the planet because it's a high carbon footprint event to make a bag of that stuff. It takes burning fossil fuels is necessary to make synthetic fertilizer, which of course causes smog, acid rain, destroys ozone layer, and emits greenhouse gases. So this is the alternative, the organic alternative. Black gold is what organic gardeners call compost. It feeds the beneficial soil life. It increases water retention of the soil, just like leaf mold does. It's like a sponge in that way. Improves drought tolerance, makes the soil friable, just the right texture you want it, crumbly. Produces humus, that organic fraction of the soil, which is resistant to decay. And it buffers the soil pH. If you have soil that's too acidic or too basic, compost will bring it closer to the middle, which is where you want it. And it boosts yields for all of these reasons. Compost happens. What is compost? It's when you allow organic matter to decompose. But now here's where I'm going to help you to learn from my mistake and a mistake many other people have made. If you take your kitchen scraps, right, vegetable, fruit scraps, you put it out in your compost bin and you expect it to become compost. That's what I expected years ago because that's what I thought composting was. Well, I didn't get compost. I got a stinky mess. And that's because all I put out there was what's called the greens, or high nitrogen, because vegetable and fruit scraps and everything else on this list is high nitrogen, and you need high carbon to balance that out, which is called the browns. Don't take this literally. All greens are not green, all browns are not brown, but just keep in mind greens are fresh organic matter and browns are the drier, old or woody plant tissue. So now that I know better, every time I put out my kitchen scraps, I put something in this brown column. And usually that is good old leaves, the leaves that you rake in the fall, but it could be anything else. Pine needles take a while to decompose, so that might not be the best choice. Paper, however, the kind that you can't recycle, right? Soiled paper, paper that's too flimsy that can't be recycled, like paper towels and tissues and all that, you know, egg cartons, you're not supposed to recycle. That's not really recyclable paper. You know, soiled cardboard, just shred it or, you know, tear up pieces and put that on top of your trimmings or of your, you know, of your vegetable and fruit scraps or trimmings from, you know, from your gardening or anything else that is on that green list. You might want to test to see if there's toxic herbicide in some of these, in either straw or hay, if you use that, or animal manure, by just seeing if peas or beans will germinate in that substance. If they do germinate, then it's okay. And don't add any of these materials to your compost bin. Sometimes commercial operations can use them, but you can't. So here are ways to have a compost. I mean, you could just have a compost pile, but most of us like to have something that's a little more contained. And I think this on the left, and this 2-bin compartment, very cheap, you know, just pallets are used for the walls, a big piece of plywood so that it doesn't saturate when it rains, and it doesn't dry out when the sun is beating down on it. And you can allow the matter in, you can allow it to become compost to mature in one side of the bin, in one of the bins, and then work on the other side and be adding while you're waiting for the one on the left to mature. And of course, a lot of it starts in the kitchen. If you have a bucket or a kitchen bucket or a pail with a fitting lid. So you want your compost bin to be accessible in all seasons. One of the things that organic gardeners are good at is being resourceful. So if you happen to have a lot of cinder blocks around, here's a perfectly good use for them, making a cinder block mulchable bin. If you want compost in a hurry, you want to keep the pile moist and keep mixing it 5 times over 2 or 3 weeks, and then allow it to cure. Just let it set for about 6 weeks, and you will have compost. Warm composting, if you turn it and add water every couple weeks, and then cure 8 to 14 weeks, takes a little bit longer, but you still get compost. In fact, if you completely ignore that pile, you turn it and add water occasionally or even never, compost still happens, and you'll have compost in about 6 months to a year. And then, in fact, that is how I compost, because I have one of these, it's called the earth machine, right? The black kind with a lid. You really can't turn compost. It's next to impossible to turn that compost bin, the stuff in that bin. But it happens anyway, you know. You just wait long enough, and you lift that lid, and there it is. A fellow named Lee Reich, who's an author, he wrote the book Weedless Gardening. And that sounds appealing, doesn't it? And you've already learned that one way to have weedless gardening is just to use plenty of mulch, because weeds just don't have a chance to get in if you've got that mulch layer. And if a couple of weeds do manage to grow, a well-mulched garden makes it really easy to just yank them out, because the ground's really soft and moist. So he came up with this idea of indoor composting. This bucket in the middle has a soil and sand mixture, and on the left there's a bucket that has you're putting your compostables in, and then you add a layer of the soil and sand on top, so it won't be smelly, and so you can do it indoors. So remember, leaf mold. I already showed this slide, so I'll move on. Red wriggler worms are an asset to your, I find them actually showing up in my compost bin. So they're out there in nature, and they love going to work on decomposing food. It is their food. And what they make, these red wriggler worms, which are very different from earthworms, they're smaller, and they have different needs than earthworms do. You get out of this high quality, nutrient-rich fertilizer and soil conditioner, even better than compost itself. So these red wriggler worms need oxygen, darkness, warmth, bedding, and you can use any of these materials, soak them, shred them, soak them, and wring them out. They need food scraps, and the food scraps need to be partially decomposed. So instead of like throwing, throwing your kitchen scraps right in, you might need to chop or blend or freeze them first to prepare them for the red wrigglers, to make it easier for them to digest. And just a handful of soil, they'll be happy in there. And you can actually do vermicomposting right beneath your kitchen sink if you choose to. It doesn't smell remarkably. You can make a dresser drawer or find an old dresser and just use the drawer from that as your vermicomposting bin. And let's talk now about Comfrey, another way to get fertility without chemicals. Comfrey is called the green manure because it has the NPK figures of 1.8 nitrogen, 0.5 phosphorus, 5.3 potassium. Now those numbers don't sound that impressive compared to the 10-10-10, but remember all those disadvantages of synthetic fertilizer. Also, the Comfrey happens to have these trace minerals, which the bagged fertilizer does not have. Now let's compare these figures to manure, which we're used to thinking of manure as really hot stuff. You know, it's got a lot of fertility, but only rabbit manure has more nitrogen than Comfrey leaves. Only chicken and rabbit manure have more phosphorus than Comfrey, and none of those manures has even close to the potassium that you find in Comfrey leaves. So you can imagine this is a great thing for the plants in your garden. What can you do with these leaves? Well, first, let me tell you that you don't want to put these in your garden. This is a perennial that will take over your garden bed if you give it half a chance, and it'll be impossible to get rid of it except for starting over, doing the sheep mulching thing and just killing it all. So give it have a dedicated Comfrey bed, nothing but Comfrey there, and just let it go. And then you chop and drop. You just use a swing blade or something, and then there you've got your leaves. And you can do that several times a year, and it'll just grow back more leaves. What can you do with those leaves? You can use them as mulch. Just drop them around your plants, add it to the mulch that's already there. You could put them in your compost pile, of course, and that would be enriching your compost pile. But here's another secret. You can make Comfrey tea, as it's called, or Comfrey fertilizer, and which just means that you chop up those leaves, put them in water, and then come back in a few weeks. And of course, it'll stink because anything organic in water, you leave it, it's going to decompose. However, you dilute it with water 1 to 10, and this is a potassium-rich liquid fertilizer that you can just deliver to your plants, just as you would any other kind of fertilizer, just irrigating right around the base of the plant and just watering them that way with that dilute Comfrey tea. And another weed that's just as good, stinging nettle. Incidentally, this is one of my favorite vegetables, stinging nettle. If you don't know about the wonders of stinging nettle, which has been rated the best land plant food in the world nutritionally, you owe it to yourself to do some research about not only the nutritional, but the medicinal benefits of stinging nettle for things like what am I thinking of? One benefit is allergies. It's been shown that that nettle tea is very effective with allergies. Also for arthritis, just as intentional stinging by bees helps people with arthritis, so does intentional stinging by stinging nettle. But let's go on to talk about what it does for plants. Just like Comfrey, you can chop it up, drown it in water. In this case, it's ready to use in a couple of weeks. And again, dilute 1 to 10, and it's great for a lot of garden plants. Now let's learn about leaves, because there's a secret here that leaves have thousands and thousands of these tiny mouths called stomata that open and close. They're closed on a hot day or when it's really windy, because otherwise the leaf would desiccate, it would dry out, it would wilt. But on a humid day or when it's raining, those mouths have to be open so they'll get the oxygen that they need, the carbon dioxide that they need. Remember, they consume carbon dioxide and they exhale, in their respiration, they release oxygen in the process of photosynthesis. Now, the water on a leaf is actually able to go into the leaf through these holes of the stomata. So in other words, leaves can drink whatever's on them. And not just the water, but whatever is dissolved in the water. And now that you know that fact, guess what? A foliar spray is the most direct way that plants can get nutrients. Compare that to applying, say, the comfrey tea or the nettle tea that I was talking about earlier. Sure, you can apply it and plants will be happy with it if you irrigate with that tea. But what if you spray the leaves with that same tea? Fill the barrel with weeds, cover it, and it can be just plain old weeds, or it could be these rich weeds that we've already talked about, the comfrey, nettle, or thistle. It doesn't matter what. In fact, you could put kitchen waste in the water and bucket of water. You can put mature compost in there. You can put manure in there. The best thing of all to put in there is anything from the sea, the seaweed meal, fish meal, and there are products that you can buy at your local nursery. Because these seaweed, kelp, and fish are rich in micronutrients, hormones, and amino acids that stimulate cell division, provide some resistance against marginal frost. It's just what plants need. It's like when you put any of these in your spray bottle and spray the leaves, you're giving those leaves direct, it's almost like an injection of nutrition. They get it immediately. So here are some tips about foliar spray. If you have a cell phone, you might want to take a picture of the slide because I need to move on. There's so much to cover, but here's some basic tips. Adding on surfactant or wetting agent, organic soaps as a little bit of that in that foliar spray, and don't spray when it's about to rain, of course. But early morning, late afternoon, or on cloudy days are good times to spray. And also during transplanting, flowering, fruit set, and drought and cold periods are especially good times when the side dressing is normally recommended. Epsom salts. I'm wondering if you've ever heard of Epsom salts being used in gardening, because what they are, magnesium sulfate, it's especially for tomatoes and peppers, and also roses, azaleas, and rhododendrons. It really improves their health and their vigor, and you'll have a much better yield, and perhaps even the fruit will taste better. It improves the absorption of nitrogen and phosphorus for these plants because they need that magnesium sulfate. So, and also corrects a magnesium deficiency, improves flower and fruit set. So here are some ideas of how to use that Epsom salts. You can sprinkle some of those granules around each transplant or in the hole when you're transplanting, when you're putting it in your garden, those tomatoes or pepper plants. Foliar spray once again, okay, a tablespoon per gallon of water every month when the blooms first appear, and irrigation, like watering with that solution also works. So now earthworms are gardener's friend because they make they give good texture to the soil, and creating all those tunnels. They help to keep the soil nice and loose and friable, and also they add to the fertility of soil. So you might want to find out how many earthworms you have in a square foot of garden that's 7 feet deep. You just dig out that quantity of soil, put it on a tarp, count the worms, and you can count the small ones just as much as the big ones. And if you have 10 or more, you're doing pretty well. Your soil is healthy. You've got well-drained soil. You have plenty of organic matter. The pH is right, is most likely going to be right where you want it, between 6 and 7. If you don't have 10 or more worms, then do some sleuthing, some detective work. Could it be that your soil is not well-drained enough? Perhaps it's compacted. Perhaps you don't have enough organic matter in there. Perhaps your pH is off. And here's a handy thing called a Brix refractometer. Now, Brix is all about nutrient density. Excuse me. So not all broccoli is created equal. The broccoli that you see on your in your supermarket might look healthy and same color and looks big and all that, but remember, it might have more water and less nutrients than your organically grown broccoli. And this is actually an instrument which I think only costs about $25. You can measure nutrient density of your food, and what are you buying at the grocery store anyway? You're not buying water. You're hopefully buying nutrients and, of course, good taste. So that's what nutrient density is all about. And what's soil pH all about? I'm sure you've heard about pH and whether it's acidic or base or alkaline or basic. Well, the reason it's important to plants is that if the pH is off, if it's too low or too high, these nutrients, remember, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are the macronutrients, but they also need all these others in the list. And for that matter, here they are, the actinomycetes and the fungi. Those are also important partners. And notice how in many cases it tapers off, and nitrogen is the poster child here. It's harder for plants to absorb nitrogen at those extremes of pH. You can measure your pH with one of these pH test kits, which is quite inexpensive. You just sprinkle a little of that powder in with the soil and water, and then it changes color. And you compare that color to the chart. Here's a quick and easy way to test, to find out if your soil is acidic or basic. If you add baking soda to your moistened soil, it'll bubble if you have acidic soil, and most of us do have acidic soil. However, if your soil is alkaline or basic, adding vinegar will make it bubble. And here's it's kind of like a soil test kit, just using red cabbage leaves, which you simmer for 10 minutes, and then take some of that cabbage water, a few inches, and then pour it onto 2 teaspoons of garden soil in a jar, and then stir it and wait for 20 to 30 minutes and check the color. And you can find this chart online, cabbage testing pH with red cabbage leaves. Imagine if you have any kids in the household, this will be a fun chemistry project too. You can test the pH of all kinds of household items, household products. Well, here is a chart that shows what the pH tolerances of various vegetables are. And the first thing I want you to notice is that every vegetable in this chart is happy between 6 and 6.5, every one. Some vegetables can tolerate quite alkaline soil, such as asparagus, beets, and cabbage. And on the other end, potatoes all the way down to 5, or eggplant all the way down to 5.5. In fact, there are quite a number of vegetables that don't mind acidic soil to that degree. So you have different approaches in gardening. You can just select vegetables that are happy in the soil pH that you happen to have, or you can work to make your soil pH right in line with this chart, the 6 to 6.5 range, and then everything will do well in your soil. So if your soil is too acidic, you can add lime, add wood ashes, or add compost. Remember, compost buffers the soil. And if your soil is too alkaline or basic, you can add sulfur. Epsom salts might work. I'm not sure about that actually. Or again, compost will buffer the soil. Wood ash is preferable to lime because it has a lot of micronutrients that lime does not have. That's what this chart shows. It compares wood ash to lime, and there's a lot more of the stuff that the plants like. Also notice that wood ash can be used to sprinkle around the base of plants to control snails and slugs because they don't like to travel on that. They also don't like to travel on anything dry, dusty, or scratchy, such as any of these things: lime, diatomaceous earth, cinders, coarse sawdust, gravel, or sand. Now, remember, soil is alive, and this is the difference between loam or garden soil and compost, because compost is alive, but it doesn't have any minerals in it. But soil texture, soil does have minerals plus whatever is at the organic component. So soil is a mixture of whatever used to be rock and whatever used to be living. That's one way to think about it. And you want your soil to have some clay, because clay is good at absorbing water and nutrients. But if you have too much clay, if you have more than 40% clay in your soil, then it's much too hard to work. It becomes easily compacted, and it's harder for roots to pass through all that dense stuff. And also sand, while it's quite porous, and so it's easy for roots to grow through it, the extremes of very sandy soil, it just doesn't hold nutrients and water well enough. It just passes right through. So the happy medium is loam, about equal parts sand and silt, which silt is larger than clay but smaller than sand. It's in between, and no more than 40% clay. How are you going to find out what your soil texture is? Here's one way. You can dig a sample from the top 8 inches of your soil, remove the stones, roots, mulch, and other chunks of organic matter. And then on top of that, pour and put 2 inches of that in a quart jar. And then add a teaspoon of dishwasher detergent, borax or Calgon. Add water to within 2 inches of the top. Shake it and let it sit for a while. It might take a week. And then finally, you'll when it becomes clear, the water is clear, all the clay has settled down. Then you can measure. The lower layer, of course, will be the sand. Those are the heavy particles. The middle layer will be the silt, and the upper layer will be the clay. And you'll be able to see those layers, mark them, and then do your math and find out what percent of each you have. And then you could use this chart here to figure out what kind of soil you have. And again, loam is the happy medium, but you can certainly work with the categories that surround the loam, the clay loam, sandy clay, sandy loam, silt loam, etc. But you don't want, it's difficult to work with the extremes. Another way you can test for soil texture is by adding small amounts of water to a small handful of soil to form a ball or a bolus. And it's when the bolus surface just glistens, that's the right degree of moisture. And then you try to make a ribbon out of it by pressing on it. And if that ribbon keeps going and going and going, you've got a clayey soil. It's like you're making a pot out of it. If you hardly can make a ribbon at all, that's sandy soil. And if it's just right, the loam, you'll be able to make a moderate sized, here it says 25 millimeter long ribbon. Soil compaction might be the most limiting factor in landscaping and in gardening, because nothing can grow in compacted soil. And what causes compaction? Well, vehicles driving on soil, but even pedestrian traffic, especially if there's a lot of clay in your soil, and especially if you walk on the soil when it's wet. So just avoid walking on your garden beds at all, and that will do great, it will ensure that your soil doesn't become compacted. You can test for soil compaction. Dig a hole that's 12 inches deep, 12 inches around, fill it with water, and wait for that water to infiltrate. Fill it again 2 hours later. After that, it's all infiltrated. And if your second infiltration takes over 45 minutes to happen, then you have, and if you don't have a very clay soil to begin with, you likely have compaction. Another quick way is burying a perforated coffee can. And if that water is going faster than a half to 1 inch per hour, then your soil is okay, it's not compacted. Or just plunging a straightened wire hanger to a depth of 1 foot, down 12 inches down. And if you bend it, if it bends when you try to move it, you've got compacted soil. If it bends right away, but if you move it around and it just travels, then the soil is not compacted. If you do have compacted soil, the Daikon radish is a vegetable that's bigger than a carrot, and it's edible, and it does the job of drilling holes in the soil for you and loosening it up. And it also suppresses weeds, provides soil cover, and scavenges nutrients into the bargain. And if you have professional help like this young fella, you can use a broad fork and poke holes in the soil. Let's talk about irrigation. If you're a serious gardener, and you want to make things easy for yourself, and if you like the advantages of drip irrigation, which are the following, you might want to invest in a drip irrigation system. It delivers water directly to the root zone of a plant, seeps slowly into the soil 1 drop at a time, reduces runoff and evaporation, so the soil particles absorb and hold the water for plants. Very few nutrients are leached from the soil, less water is wasted on weeds, saves both time and effort. You would flush the system and store it for winter. And you can add a timer, so you don't even have to bother about deciding when to stop and start it. Of course, you wouldn't need it after a rain, but in periods of dry weather, you could set this drip irrigation system to go, and it's just what your plants need. Soaker hoses can be used, however, and they're cheaper, but they don't work well on slopes. They only work in lengths of up to 200 feet, and some are even made of recycled rubber, which may not be good for food crops. If you use soaker hoses, you would hold it in place with wire pins. You'd add a layer of mulch to cover them. Leave the hose running until the water has penetrated 6 to 12 inches into the soil. And you can also automate soaker hoses with a timer. You could also invest in a hose extension wand just to deliver the water right where you want it. And speaking of water, what if you're going away on vacation? You don't want your plants to, if no one's going to be coming over or tending to your tomatoes or other vegetables, then you're concerned about drought and whether those plants will get enough water. If you bury a clay pot in the soil right next to it, fill it with water, then cover it so that no animals can drop in and drown, and so that the water won't evaporate. You can imagine that that water will be seeping through the clay pot and keeping the soil around it moist the whole time you're gone. You can buy a moisture meter to find out how your soil is doing. And in fact, there's a three-way meter that measures not only moisture, but also light levels and pH. Now let's say you're just starting out and you're deciding where you want to have a garden. Sunlight, at least 6 hours a day, is optimal. Fill in or avoid standing water. South-facing slope would be better than a north-facing slope. You might want to test for soil type, for pH, nutrients, and drainage. So the pH and nutrients can be discovered if you send your sample to soil testing laboratory. There's one at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I'm sure there are some in Connecticut as well. I know there are, but I live in Amherst, so that's the one I know about. You may not need to test for the soil, have the soil test done if you can tell that a lot of other things grow quite well. If you're starting with a lawn, for example, you know that lawn is a healthy lawn. Air circulation, you want to have an open area, but not too windy, so windbreak or trellises might help. You want your garden to be near where you live, near your water source, near your compost pile, and again, you don't want to be walking, or you don't want other people to be walking on that garden bed. Keep in mind, however, that even though 6 hours is optimal, there are many plants that will tolerate 3 to 6 hours of sun per day or constant dappled shade. So don't despair if you don't have that full sun option. Plants grown for their stems, leaves, or buds often tolerate light shade. However, those grown for their roots or fruits, like tomatoes or carrots, tend to need more sun. Here are some of those shade-tolerant plants. And notice the ones with asterisk after them will give you smaller yields than full sun, but you'll still get a decent yield. And the ones that don't have their asterisk, they do just fine. They're giving you as much of a harvest as they would if they had full sun. You don't want your garden right near a tree, or anywhere near a tree for that matter, because and for that matter, you also don't want your compost bin right near trees, because what'll happen is if you don't have some means of some kind of barrier that will prevent tree roots from accessing your compost, they will definitely grow right into your compost. They love that compost, and if that compost has been sitting there a while and you haven't used it, you'll come out one day, try to get some help yourself to some of that compost, and it's completely invaded by the roots of the trees nearby, or shrubs, or whatever might be near it. So either don't site your, and the reason, by the way, that the roots are competing is that they all, in general, trees and shrubs, their roots are right near the surface. That's where the water and nutrients are. So they grow out much more than they grow down. So unless you have a barrier, some way to prevent tree roots from getting into your garden, say a raised garden bed or something, you're going to want to site your garden bed well away from trees. Now, if you don't have much space, what are some ways that you can make the most of your garden? Use transplants and get an early jump on the season. Grow productive, space-efficient, extended harvest crops. There they are. Grow several plantings of short season crops. Grow compact crops that don't take up much space. Grow specialty crops, something that you can't buy at the grocery store, so you're getting a good bang for your buck. Grow vertical with trellises. Grow cut and come again salad greens. Remove plants that are no longer productive. So when you're done harvesting, and then go ahead and plan ahead and make sure that you're going to put something in that space as soon as you're no longer using it for the plant that was there. And then staggering and interplanting. So let's talk about those details. you buy a packet of seed and the instructions say put them 6 inch, put the seeds 6 inches apart in rows 3 feet apart, and that's your typical row garden. Well, what's the problem with that? You've got a lot of wasted space. You're walking in all this 3 feet, and don't forget you're compacting the soil here as you walk, and that can cause some problems even to the roots that are trying to grow underneath there. Compare it to someone who has either a raised bed or a bed shaped and having the same shape as a raised bed, a rectangle that you can easily reach it from the sides or from the end. But you can get a lot more plants in a rectangular bed than in rows. And I'm going to come back to that slide soon, but consider, instead of having just rows like you just saw, staggering them, and you can get more plants even compared to the ones. Now, so now let's look at this slide. This fellow Edward Smith, and it doesn't even look like he's having a lot of fun gardening. I mean, and I think he deserves to call his book The Vegetable Gardener's Bible, because this fellow, he lives in Vermont. He grows so much. He knows so much about gardening. He's also written the Vegetable Gardener Containers, a Container Gardener's Bible. So if you're into container gardening, that's a book you want to read as well. WORD stands for wide rows, organic methods, raised beds, and deep soil. That's what he likes. Wide rows, just like I showed you with, like a raised bed, right? And that's the R of that, of the 4 things that he's reminding about. And then deep soil, because he's really got a lot of organic matter going way down, and the roots love it. So now interplanting is another way to make maximum use of your garden beds. Let's say we've got 3 tomato plants, as in this illustration, and you've got to put them far apart because they're going to get bigger. You don't want to put them really close to each other. But at first, that's a lot of wasted space. So why not use all that space while those plants are growing for smaller crops that will be faster growing, and you can harvest even before those tomato plants get bigger and start to shade them out. Here are some interplanting ideas. And the one in the upper right is the famous 3 sisters combination that Native Americans use. The corn provides support for runner beans that can climb up the corn stalks. And then the squash plants keep the soil moist and cool, and serve as a weed suppressant as well. So if you surround the larger, slow-growing vegetables with smaller, fast-maturing vegetables, that's the typical pattern of interplanting. Examples of that are putting spinach around the tomatoes, which matures before the tomatoes grow enough to shade it, or onions and cabbage. And the onions will mature before the cabbages crowd them out. And the cabbages will then shade the onion bulbs, keeping the soil cool and moist. This is a very handy chart to have. veggieharvest.com calendars. This is for zone 6. And as you can see, it'll tell you what to do. Let's say if you got kale and you've already harvested that kale in mid-May. What can you do there? You can plant anything that lettuce, sweet potatoes, winter squash, summer squash, carrots, cucumbers. All of these plants are great to start when your soil is really warmed up. And then also don't forget about all these wonderful crops that you can grow towards the end of the summer and even into the fall. So there they are. And in fact, crops such as carrots and kale taste better after they've endured some cold weather. So here are the spring plantings: super hardy crops, average crops, tender crops, and heat-loving crops. All of them have their times related to when is that last frost. And of course, with global warming, we've got earlier and earlier last frost. Here in Amherst in Massachusetts, I don't think we had any frost the entire month of May. And traditionally, it's been the last day of May is thought of as being the last day of frost. Here are the fall plantings, 4 months before first frost, the leeks, 3 months before these vegetables, 2 months before these vegetables, and you can even sow lettuce, spinach, and parsley in the fall for an early spring crop. And you can use milk container hot caps to protect plants that if there's an unexpected frost, that'll keep them going, protect them from that frost, and then just lift them off in the day when the temperatures have risen back above freezing. Here are some advantages of raised garden beds. They can be comfortable, accessible. They can keep out some animals at least, and you might need to line it with netting to keep out burrowing animals. And the best thing about them is you're putting in what you want. There's no rocks, there's no poison soil. You don't have to worry about the quality of the soil. You're starting with the best, and we'll talk about that later. You won't have any drainage or compaction problems. You can control the watering. It looks great. And the disadvantages are minor, really. So, and remember how gardeners are resourceful. So what do you have that you could create a raised garden with? Well, often wood is used, but cinder blocks could work, wattle construction, even logs. Use a kind of wood that won't rot as fast, such as cedar. Black locust is another. A 4x8 construction is typical, 4x8 dimensions, 4 feet by 8 feet. And to fill raised beds, this is actually the simplest formula really would be 1 part topsoil to 1 part compost. Some people also add 1 part sand. So there are 3 different ingredients in equal measure. If you have a tall raised bed and you realize that it's going to cost a lot of money to get these ingredients and to fill up that bed, consider putting logs at the bottom, because they will eventually decompose and become part of the nutrition of that, the nutrients of that garden bed. And so it's kind of like a filler, which also ultimately becomes part of the fertility of your garden. And also considered galvanized beds because they'll last forever. The ultimate raised bed, there it is, milk carton crates stacked, and then the landscaping fabric and hardware cloth separating, so the soil isn't all the way up there to that waist high. It's just in that section above the milk carton crates. A fellow named Sepp Holzer is a farmer in Austria who figured out that he could have a heated bed, which was important to him because it's so cold in the Alps, by using logs and branches, and then putting organic matter on top of that, because the decomposing logs and branches creates heat. So he has a heated bed. Also, they trap moisture, and a bed like this never needs irrigation, literally, because there's always available moisture from those waterlogged branches and stumps or whatever you're using. So here's another illustration of the raised bed concept. And you don't have to dig the trench first. You could just lay those branches right on the soil surface, and then either turf with the grass face down, or just think of this as a kind of a sheet mulching operation where you put organic matter on top, and you can grow a lot of things, whether it's annuals or perennials, on a raised bed. That's called Hugelkultur. No presentation about gardening is complete without making sure that everyone knows what poison ivy looks like. Leaves of 3, let it be. Notice that the margins of those leaflets do not have small jagged teeth like blackberry or raspberry leaves do. Some people can confuse the two. Notice also that if you see a vine like this with hairs coming out, that is a poison ivy vine. Never, ever burn poison ivy vines. If they're attached to a piece of wood and you burn that wood and the poison ivy is there, it can send you to the emergency room. The fumes from the poison ivy, or even be fatal. Interestingly, poison ivy is a native vine, and birds do eat the fruit in the winter as a food source. But it's understandable that you want, and if you're liable to make contact with poison ivy, you'll want to control its spread on your property. And if you do happen to brush against poison ivy, reach for jewelweed. It grows in wet places And if you crush the plant and use the juice and apply that to the area where you've been exposed to poison ivy, you will not get the rash. It's also good for treating the rash. Another plant that's good for that is sweet fern. It's a shrub. You can take a bath in sweet fern tea, and that's great for a bad case of poison ivy. And then there's the product called Technu that you can get at the grocery store, which is quite effective for poison ivy rash. Crop rotation is something else I'd like to talk about. It prevents the buildup of soil-borne pests and diseases, and it allows for the replenishment and efficient use of soil nutrients. So instead of growing the same plant in the same place, for example, tomatoes, if you traditionally always grow your tomatoes in the same part of your garden, there might be an issue with the pests and diseases just lurking. You know, if they were in contact with that plant before the time of harvest, they're just sitting waiting for another chance to go at that plant. So if you keep them moving around, it's a moving target for those pests and diseases. Also, different plants have different soil nutrient needs. So here are the heavy feeders, and the tomatoes would be one of them, the leaf and fruit crops. The lighter feeders are the root crops and legumes. Legumes actually enrich the soil. So this 4-season system is a good way to to plan your crop rotation. So the first year, you would have those legumes that are nitrogen fixing, and you can also include the potatoes in that first year. And then the second year that the soil is now enriched with nitrogen, go ahead and plant those the crops that you harvest the leaves of, and corn also works well in that second year. The third year, the crops that you harvest the fruit of, like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers. The fruit is anything that follows the flower for the purposes of this crop rotation. And then the root vegetables, onions, garlic, turnips, beets, carrots, radishes, is the fourth year. After the fourth year, in the fifth year, once again, you do the legumes that will enrich the soil again. So let's start with those legumes and talk about peas. There are a lot of different kinds of peas. There's the green or English peas, and there's the snow or snap peas. And each kind of pea could be vining or dwarf. There are different varieties. And among those green peas, you can have the extra early or mid-season. You can also have wrinkle seeded or smooth seeded. The wrinkle peas are sweeter. The smooth ones are hardier for early spring planting and fall harvests. And some things to keep in mind about growing peas: they can survive frosts, but won't tolerate temperatures over 75 degrees. So you can plant mid to late summer for a fall crop, where the corn or pole beans will provide shade for those pea plants when it is over 75 degrees. When you're done harvesting, cut those spent vines at ground level and leave the roots in the ground, because remember, they're adding nitrogen, and that's part of that crop of nitrogen, the source of nitrogen that they've, and they get that nitrogen dioxide from the air, by the way, that's from the atmosphere, with the help of another symbiosis with roots. In this case, it's with bacteria that are fixing that atmospheric nitrogen and make it available to the plant. And then that nitrogen is next year available to other plants as well. When you have pea or bean or corn seeds, which are fairly large, you can pre-germinate them simply by putting them in wrapping them up in a moist paper towel, keeping that paper towel moist until they germinate. And the advantages are, you'll notice which seeds are viable and which aren't. There might be some seeds that are not healthy enough to germinate. And then you can go ahead and put them in the gardens. Let's say it's about to rain, or you have a chance to irrigate right away. You can put them in the garden exactly where you want them. You don't have to worry about thinning. Shell and snap peas are both options with shell and snap beans. Scarlet runner bean is actually both. These sensational red flowers makes them ornamental as well. So one thing to keep in mind is that pole beans will produce 3 times the yield of bush beans, and they will bear until the first frost. So it's a great use of space if you can grow pole beans. If you grow bush beans, you can stagger the plantings at 2-week intervals until 2 months before the first frost for a continuous harvest. So now we're ready to think about the second year, the leaf crops, and those would include the lettuce and mesclun. Remember about interplanting. So these are small, fast maturing crops that you could plant near taller vegetables, and you could harvest before those vegetables will crowd them out. As the weather warms, you can plant heat-resistant cultivars, and in midsummer switch to head or romaine types, making successive sowings in shady areas for a fall harvest. Spinach, grow in moist, nitrogen-rich soil. Buy fresh seeds every year. So you can sow spinach as soon as you can work the soil, and you can make successive plantings every 10 days until mid-May. Harvest the entire crop at first sign of bolting. And bolting means you start to see that flowering stalk right in the center. I love Asian greens. They grow well in cool weather. You can plant them in early spring, again in the fall. You can plant them thickly and harvest them with scissors. They're edible at any stage of growth, including flowering shoots. The taste and nutrition are both superb. Why not avail ourselves of these wonderful vegetables? There are just numerous sources, books, websites that will teach you about how to grow. And it's not hard to get the seeds for these plants. And some nurseries might carry starts for some of them as well. Everyone knows about broccoli. You could choose a fast maturing like Pac-Man for a spring crop of broccoli if you like. And you would keep cutting the side shoots until the weather turns too hot or too cold. The whole idea with potatoes is to, as the stem grows from those seeds, they're called seeds, those cut up pieces of potato. As the stem grows, you surround it with soil, and then that stem becomes root. And of course, wherever there's a root, with a potato, there can be potatoes that are grown there. So that will grow out of that stem or out of what is now a root. So you can see here in a garbage can, that stem kept growing, it kept getting filled, that stem became root, and that there are so many potatoes then that are the result that can be harvested just in a garbage can or in a bag. And if you have a bed, well, you just keep on mounding, you put them in a trough and then keep on mounding that soil as the stem grows. As the vines grow, you would hill the soil or leave straw or compost over them. That's another way. Once the plants blossom, stop hilling up the soil and apply a thick mulch to conserve moisture and keep down the weeds. And don't forget, potatoes are one of those crops that really like acidic soil. Acid soil provides good growing conditions and reduces the chance of a common disease called scab. How about corn? Plant in blocks rather than rows to promote pollination. That makes a lot of sense because this is a windborne, the pollen is windborne and it's wind pollinated, not pollinated by butterflies and bees. So if it's born in, if you grow them in blocks rather than rows, there's more of a chance that those corn ears will be well pollinated and you'll have as many kernels as possible on that ear. It's also just a great use of space. Again, you can plant early, mid-season, or late types for an extended harvest if you have those different varieties on hand. Planting 3 seeds together every 15 inch and then thin them, spare the healthiest of the 3 seedlings. Consider buying heritage or heirloom seeds. I actually love these old-fashioned varieties, memories of my youth. We didn't have sweet corn back then. We had just regular corn, and I think it really was a hearty tasting corn. So the third year, the plants you grow for their fruits, and tomatoes are the most popular garden plant out there. More people grow tomatoes than any other vegetable. And the secret about starting tomatoes from seed, you pot on and harden off. Potting on has to do with as those seeds get bigger, you give them their own cell and their own space. And then as they get bigger still, give them even more space and bigger pots. And then they'll be ready to put out when the weather is warmer. And hardening off means that you start to put them out on the deck or on your porch or what have you. When the weather gets cool, don't let them stay out in freezing weather, obviously, that'll kill them. But that hardens them off and makes them tough and just gradually exposing them to colder and colder weather. Interestingly, it also toughens those plants if you brush them with your hand or set a fan on them. And that stimulates this. They grow stronger stems. Whoop. I'm not sure what's happened here. There we go. Okay, so now with tomatoes, when you have, first, if you buy your transplants, don't buy transplants with fruits or lush green foliage. This is counterintuitive, perhaps, but I guess that's it's not a good stage to put plants in the ground. You would bury the stems up to the first true leaves. Just like the potato plants, that stem is going to become root. And notice how you're burying the tomato plant in this diagram at an angle so that all of that stem is fairly near the surface of the soil where most of the nutrients and water are going to be, rather than plunging it as deep as possible into your soil. And a bright, airy spot, 10+ hours of sun if possible. Tomatoes want a lot of sun. Leave space between the plants. And you would pinch those suckers there as they grow between the stems and the main stem, the leaf stems and the main stem, because otherwise the plants will become too bushy. And remember all these different varieties of plants you can get. So there's so many. There's the cherry tomatoes, of course. There's the larger tomatoes. There are tomatoes for cooking. Consider having different varieties instead of just using one variety and having a massive amount of it that you won't be able to use. So the best companions for tomatoes are basil and borage, which repel insect pests, improve pollination in case of basil, and it's great for the health and flavor as well. Carrot roots are good because they break up the soil around tomatoes, and they're ready to be harvested, so they can be a companion crop in that way, interplanting. Spinach and lettuce can be used interplanting around tomatoes. And chives, garlic, marigolds, mints, nasturtiums, and parsley all are effective repelling insect pests that might otherwise be harmful to your tomato plants. However, don't use brassicas, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, etc., near tomatoes because they inhibit the growth of your tomato plants. Fennel also does. Potato, if it's near tomatoes, increases susceptibility to early and late blight fungus, and the corn attracts the tomato fruitworm. Keep that away from your tomatoes as well. So if you want to save your tomato seeds, you can put those seeds in water, and that slippery stuff that surrounds seeds will then decompose and after a while, and then you just blot them dry in a paper towel and store them in an envelope, and they're ready to go when you next late winter when you start your seeds. Another member of the Solanaceae family, the eggplants, and they also need a lot of sun. Steadily warm growing conditions for at least 3 months. Consider growing in raised beds. And you could interplant them with an early crop such as lettuce as well. Peppers, they take a long time to germinate and to start, so plan ahead if you want to grow them from seed. If you do choose to buy starts, choose transplants with strong stems and dark green leaves, but no fruit or start from seed. Space transplants about 1.5 feet apart in rows, at least two feet apart, if you're doing rows, of course. But again, I would urge that you use raised beds, and you don't need to have rows at all. Protect the young plants in chilly weather. If you're growing melons, and they need a lot of sun, and they need plenty of air circulation, they need a lot of fertility as well. remove the flowers and smaller fruits from the vines after midsummer. There's no point in allowing those vines to have flowers and fruits that won't give you a mature fruit. So if you just remove those flowers, the plants will have to devote all their energy to maturing the fruits that are already there. The same is true of squash and pumpkins. You would pinch off the growing tips when the vines grow to 5 feet to encourage fruit-bearing side shoots. You would then remove all remaining flowers in midsummer, just like you would with melons. Cucumbers are a vine, and so giving them support is a great idea. You need to protect them from heat. So planting taller crops at the southern end or adding a shade cloth to block 40 to 50% of the sunlight during a hot spell is a good idea. Mulching, like any other plant, is a great idea as well. And side dressing of fertilizer after the vines develop runners and the first flowers appear. And now we're around to the 4th year, the root crops. Turnips can be planted in midsummer, about 2 months before the first frost. Fall crops are often sweeter and provide a longer harvest period than spring plantings. You can also sow beets every 2 weeks until the temperatures reach 75 degrees. Radishes are remarkably quick in maturing. Just as little as 3 weeks you can have radishes. So they are one of those crops that you can interplant around slower growing, larger vegetables. And you can sow them every week as soon as you can work the soil if you really love your radishes. Keep doing that until early summer. And you can sow again in late summer for that matter, and sow winter radishes in midsummer for a fall harvest. There are 2 types of carrots. There's the blocky ball type, which is Chantenay and Danvers, that can handle heavy or shallow soil. There's the slender carrots, Nantes and Imperator, for example, that need deep, loose soil. And if you want to pre-germinate carrot seeds or other small seeds, parsnips, parsley, onions, spinach, lettuce, and mustard, here's how you do it. Mix a cup of water, a tablespoon of cornstarch. Heat, stir until the mixture thickens. Pour into a flat pan and let it set. Sprinkle the seeds on top. Cover with plastic wrap and wait. When they start to germinate, you would scoop them out with a spoon and plant them in holes, or you could cut 1 corner of an envelope and squeeze that gel and seed mixture from the envelope into a furrow. Parsnips, what a delicious vegetable this is, and they taste sweeter after frost. You can leave them in the ground all winter. The suggestions about growing from seed, you should use fresh seed, and you should soak that seed overnight before planting, whether or not you actually let them germinate, as I described doing with small seeds. And there's so many kinds of onions and garlic. You would plant them in spring. Onions like cool weather. There are even perennial onions, such as these, or these. I've got a lot of walking onions in my garden. They're really amazing vegetables, and they really do plant themselves. As you see, they just, those bulblets at the top of the stem will sprout, make their own stems, and then eventually that plant is just going to bend over and plant itself a considerable distance away from the bulb of that parent plant. Welsh onion is another spring onion. It's also called spring onion. Delicious flavor and ornamental, really. And the bees love it. It's a pollinator plant. Chives, another wonderful pollinator plant that is a versatile vegetable. So are garlic chives or Chinese chives. And then there's the best tasting onion of all, the wild leek or ramp, which you can establish that it'll grow in full sun, even though in the wild it only happens in shade. If you want to grow your own strawberries, pH of 6 to 6.2 is ideal. Don't plant where raspberries, strawberries, or solanaceous plants have grown before. You can plant both early and late bearing varieties for an extended harvest. And there are different ways to do it, depending on whether you have day neutral strawberries or June bearing strawberries. Extension.UNH, University of New Hampshire, Edu is a good resource for learning about growing strawberries. If you have deer around, they can leap over tall fences, as you can see. So you've got to have a really tall, like 8-foot high fence to keep them out. If you're doing that approach, electrified wire fence can also work. But consider this: I've never tried it myself, but I think it makes sense to me. If you hang fish line, and if you string fish line to stakes around about a yard high around your garden bed, and the deer will walk right into it because it can't see it. And then it doesn't know what to do because it can't jump over something that it can't see. So it might really be effective in a low-cost strategy of keeping deer out of your garden. People try different kinds of repellents. Sometimes they work for a while, but deer tend to get used to them. One strategy, other than the ones you're seeing here, of dealing with woodchucks, other than besides just putting repulsive stuff around, surrounding it around your garden, or putting it right into your holes and making them banishing them from your property, if that's another approach. And motion detectors which trigger bursts of water or a loud radio. But some people like to just plant stuff that woodchucks and rabbits like to eat in other places beside the garden, and give them their feast, and maybe they'll just hang out there and won't even bother with your garden. Squirrels sometimes are thirsty, and that's why they might take bites out of every one of your tomatoes. So if you offer them a bird bath, perhaps they won't bother with your tomatoes. There are also various substances which are noxious to squirrels. And netting, of course, can be effective as well. It can also be effective with rabbits, and likewise, garlic, red peppers, blood, ammonia, vinegar are repellents for rabbits. I don't know if any of these strategies really work with birds. They might be effective, but crows are awfully smart. Probably dogs are the best line of defense with just about any varmint that wants to eat your vegetables. And as far as the pests are concerned, there's nothing like floating row covers to keep them out. And it allows air, water, and up to 85% of ambient light to pass through. So consider ambient light to keep out, consider floating row covers to keep out pests like aphids, cabbage maggots, cutworms, caterpillars. And of course, there are other strategies too, but Colorado potato beetles, flea beetles, tarnished plant bug, Japanese beetles, and you can shake them off the plants, and again apply floating row covers or set out baited traps. And here are the heroes, which are going to feast on your pests and keep their numbers in check. With ladybugs, it's the larvae that are voracious predators of the aphids, and as adults, they are actually pollinators. So it's good to have pollinator plants. Maybe 15% of your garden should be plants that will attract these beneficial hunters. Lacewings are also pollinators as adults, and great at controlling pest populations. So are syrphid flies. Again, they are pollinators as adult insects. Predatory bugs are attracted by pollen of many flowers: corn, buckwheat, willows, bunch grasses, shrubs. Hunting and parasitic wasps, again, pollen and nectar plants. Spiders, perennial plantings and straw mulches provide shelter. Taconid flies, again, the pollinator plants will bring them in. So welcome pollinators, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, moths, wasps, flies, and beetles. We have an alarming decline in insects. Back in the day, and I've been an adult for half a century now. I remember as a child, there used to be insects on the grill of your car or on the windshield when you were driving. That doesn't happen anymore. because there are just fewer insects out there. So we've had drastic declines in insect pollination, and of course in birds and so many other animals. So it's important to think of your yard as a place where you can invite nature back, because if that's a fellow named Doug Tallamy, an author of Bringing Nature Home, talks about how important native plants are for the caterpillars, especially because they offer edible food for those caterpillars, which in turn are the essential for raising chicks. Bird is the ideal baby food for baby chicks. 80% of all plants need pollinators to set seed, and 1/3 of our food is pollinated. Pollinators make a difference. The one in the middle didn't get pollen from any other flower. The one on the right managed to get some windborne pollen, but only the one on the left, which was actively pollinated, insects bring in that fruit pollen from other plants, was able to grow to mature size. So environmentalists are asking us to reduce our lawns by 25% and grow a lot of native plants for wildlife. And it's so wonderful to garden with children. It's really a real sense of adventure for them, a sense of accomplishment. It boosts their self-esteem, and it's so stimulating, and they learn a lot. Here's some of the flowers they might enjoy. Here's some of the vegetables that they might enjoy growing and eating. And what a wonderful thing it is when children learn what real food tastes like, and that's the food that they prefer. And of course, they'll be proud to be feeding you as well if they grew that food and helped to put it on the table. Real food is not just food that's grown in an organic way so that it's healthy, but it is also grown with human dignity and health in mind, animal welfare in mind, social justice, and environmental sustainability. It's all about truly nourishing producers, consumers, communities, and the earth. And why not grow food everywhere possible? Even if you don't have land yourself, you can take a look around and see what land is not being used and get permission to use that land, or in some cases, in vacant lots or what have you, just go ahead and grow. We really need to think of our land as being a valuable resource where food can be grown. It'll be great for the self-reliance that we'll need in the decades to come. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions or hear any comments that you have at this time.